Naomi Walker never thought that an ordinary dinner would turn into a nightmare. When she walked into an upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago, she couldn't imagine that in just an hour she would be escorted out in front of dozens of cameras, accused of a crime she didn't commit. But they had one big mistake: they didn't know who her husband was. At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. In the heart of Chicago, under the glow of city lights, Naomi Walker stepped out of her car, handing the keys to the valet. The cool evening breeze brushed against her skin as she walked towards the grand entrance of Le Jardin, an elite restaurant known for its exclusivity and opulence. Naomi, a renowned heart surgeon, was no stranger to luxury, but tonight was different. Tonight she sought a moment of peace, a celebration of her own resilience and success in a world that often tried to diminish her achievements. As she entered the restaurant, the soft hum of classical music and the clinking of glasses filled the air. The maitre d' greeted her with a polite smile, but Naomi couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. She was used to navigating spaces where she was the only person of color, but the weight of that reality never lessened. As she was led to her table, she noticed the subtle glances and whispered comments from the other patrons. She held her head high, her confidence unwavering, but the tension in the room was palpable. Naomi took a deep breath, reminding herself that she deserved to be here, that her presence was a testament to her strength and determination. As she settled into her seat, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had overcome countless obstacles to reach this point in her career, and she refused to let the judgmental gazes of strangers diminish her accomplishments. But as the night wore on, the unease that had been gnawing at her grew stronger. The waitstaff seemed to be deliberately ignoring her, and when she finally managed to flag down a server, she was met with a cold, dismissive attitude. She tried to brush it off, attributing it to the busy atmosphere of the restaurant, but the feeling of being unwelcome was impossible to ignore. As she finished her meal, she noticed a commotion near the entrance. The manager, a stern-looking man with a rigid posture, was speaking in hushed tones with a group of employees. Their eyes flicked towards Naomi, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong. Before she could react, the manager approached her table, his expression grave. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest as she was escorted to a private room, the eyes of the other patrons following her every move. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. As the door closed behind her, she found herself face to face with two police officers. Their expressions were stern, their voices devoid of empathy as they began to question her. "We've received a report of fraudulent activity," one of the officers said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. Naomi's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. She had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a criminal. The humiliation was overwhelming, but she refused to let it break her. She held her ground, her voice steady as she defended herself against the baseless accusations. But as the interrogation continued, she realized that this was about more than just a misunderstanding. This was about the color of her skin, about the deeply ingrained prejudices that still plagued society. And as she stood there, surrounded by the cold, unyielding faces of the police officers, she made a silent vow. She would not let this injustice stand. She would fight back, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. And so, with a fierce determination burning in her eyes, Naomi Walker prepared to take on the system that sought to silence her. As Naomi was escorted out of the restaurant, the weight of humiliation and anger pressed down on her. The eyes of the patrons followed her every move, their whispers of judgment echoing in her ears. She could feel the heat of embarrassment rising in her cheeks, but she refused to let it show. She held her head high, her gaze steady, as she was led through the opulent dining room and out into the cool night air. The police officers flanked her on either side, their presence a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play. As they reached the curb, Naomi turned to face the manager, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and composure. "This isn't over," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The manager's expression flickered with a moment of uncertainty, but he quickly regained his composure, his voice cold and dismissive. "We have security footage and witness statements," he replied. "I suggest you cooperate with the authorities." Naomi's mind raced as she was ushered into the back of a police car. She knew she had to act quickly, that every second counted in a situation like this. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of her phone. With a swift motion, she dialed her husband's number, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for him to answer. Jason Walker, a prominent lawyer and human rights activist, picked up on the second ring. His voice was warm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the cold, unyielding world she found herself in. "Naomi, what's wrong?" he asked, his tone immediately shifting to one of concern. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she recounted the events of the evening. She could hear the anger building in Jason's voice as he listened, his resolve strengthening with each word. "I'll handle this," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I'll make sure they pay for what they've done." As the police car pulled away from the curb, Naomi couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. She knew that Jason would stop at nothing to clear her name and expose the injustice she had faced. But as the city lights blurred past the window, she also knew that this was about more than just her own vindication. This was about shining a light on the systemic discrimination that plagued society, about fighting for those who had been silenced and marginalized. And as she sat there, her determination burning brighter than ever, she made a silent vow. She would not rest until justice was served, until the voices of the oppressed were heard loud and clear. Meanwhile, Jason sprang into action, his mind racing with a whirlwind of strategies and plans. He knew that time was of the essence, that every moment counted in a battle like this. He picked up his phone, his fingers dialing the numbers of trusted colleagues and allies. He reached out to fellow lawyers, activists, and journalists, his voice filled with a sense of urgency and purpose. He recounted Naomi's ordeal, his words painting a vivid picture of the injustice she had faced. He could hear the outrage in their voices, the shared determination to fight back against the system that sought to silence them. As he hung up the phone, he knew that he had set a powerful machine in motion. The wheels of justice were turning, and there was no stopping them now. He turned his attention to the legal battle ahead, his mind sharp and focused as he began to gather evidence and build a case. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges and obstacles, but he was ready to face them head-on. He would leave no stone unturned, no avenue unexplored, in his quest for justice. And as he sat there, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal documents, he made a silent promise. He would not rest until Naomi's name was cleared, until the truth was brought to light, and until those responsible were held accountable for their actions. As the night wore on, the story of Naomi's unjust treatment began to spread like wildfire. Jason's calls had ignited a spark that quickly grew into a blazing inferno of outrage and support. Social media platforms were ablaze with posts and comments, the hashtag Justice for Naomi trending nationwide. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of discrimination, their voices joining together in a chorus of solidarity and demand for change. The media picked up the story, their headlines blazing with the scandal that had unfolded at Le Jardin. Journalists flocked to the restaurant, their cameras and microphones capturing the tense atmosphere as patrons and staff alike were questioned about the events of the evening. The restaurant's management found themselves under a harsh spotlight, their actions scrutinized and criticized by the public eye. They issued a hastily prepared statement, their words a feeble attempt to deflect blame and downplay the severity of the situation. But the damage had already been done, and the tide of public opinion was not in their favor. Meanwhile, Jason and his team of lawyers worked tirelessly, their efforts fueled by a burning desire for justice. They pored over security footage and witness statements, their eyes sharp and focused as they searched for any inconsistencies or evidence of wrongdoing. They uncovered a pattern of discrimination, a trail of bias and prejudice that had been woven into the very fabric of the restaurant's operations. They found countless instances of black patrons being treated unfairly, their complaints brushed aside and their voices silenced. The evidence was overwhelming, and it was clear that this was not an isolated incident, but a systemic issue that had been allowed to fester and grow unchecked. As the legal battle unfolded, Naomi found herself at the center of a media storm. She stood tall and proud, her voice unwavering as she spoke out against the injustice she had faced. She became a symbol of strength and resilience, her story inspiring others to stand up and fight back against the discrimination that had plagued their own lives. She was interviewed by major news outlets, her words echoing through the airwaves as she called for change and accountability. She spoke of the humiliation she had endured, of the anger and determination that had fueled her fight for justice. And as she stood there, her voice ringing out loud and clear, she knew that she was not alone. She was part of a movement, a force for change that would not be silenced or ignored. And with each passing day, that force grew stronger, its momentum unstoppable as it barreled towards a reckoning that was long overdue. As the days turned into weeks, the public outcry over Naomi's treatment reached a fever pitch. Protests erupted in the streets of Chicago, the voices of the people echoing through the city as they demanded justice and accountability. The restaurant, once a symbol of luxury and exclusivity, now stood as a stark reminder of the deep-seated prejudices that still plagued society. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that those responsible would not be able to hide from the consequences of their actions for much longer. Behind the scenes, Jason and his legal team were preparing for a monumental battle. They had gathered an overwhelming amount of evidence, their case meticulously crafted and ready for presentation. They had uncovered a web of deceit and discrimination, a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to fester and grow unchecked within the walls of Le Jardin. The restaurant's management had tried to sweep the scandal under the rug, their attempts to silence the truth growing more desperate with each passing day. But Jason was not deterred. He knew that the fight for justice would not be easy, that there would be obstacles and setbacks along the way. But he was prepared to face them head-on, his resolve unwavering as he stood on the precipice of a legal showdown that would shake the very foundations of the establishment. The day of the hearing finally arrived, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The courtroom was filled to capacity, the eyes of the world watching as the drama unfolded. Naomi sat tall and proud, her gaze steady as she faced the sea of faces before her. She knew that this was not just her fight, but the fight of every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. As the proceedings began, Jason stood before the judge, his voice ringing out loud and clear as he presented the evidence. He spoke of the systemic discrimination that had been allowed to flourish within the restaurant, of the countless lives that had been affected by the prejudice and bias that had gone unchecked for far too long. He called witnesses to the stand, their testimonies painting a vivid picture of the injustices that had been committed. The restaurant's management squirmed in their seats, their discomfort growing with each damning piece of evidence that was presented. They tried to deflect blame, their excuses growing more feeble and desperate with each passing moment. But the truth was undeniable, and it was clear that the tide of public opinion was not in their favor. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge's expression was grave, his voice filled with a sense of finality, as he delivered his verdict. The restaurant was found guilty of discrimination, their actions condemned by the weight of the evidence that had been presented. The room erupted in cheers, the sound of justice ringing out loud and clear as the people celebrated the victory that had been hard-won and long overdue. In the aftermath of the verdict, the city of Chicago breathed a collective sigh of relief, the weight of injustice lifted from its shoulders. But the fight was far from over. Naomi and Jason knew that this was just the beginning, that the battle for true equality and justice was an ongoing struggle that would require unwavering dedication and perseverance. They stood side by side, their voices echoing through the halls of power as they called for systemic change and accountability. They demanded that the restaurant's management be held responsible for their actions, that they face the consequences of the discrimination they had allowed to flourish under their watch. And as the days turned into weeks, their calls were answered. The restaurant's management was stripped of their positions, their names forever tarnished by the scandal that had unfolded. The establishment itself was forced to undergo a complete overhaul, its policies and practices scrutinized and reformed to ensure that such injustices would never be allowed to happen again. But Naomi and Jason knew that the fight for justice did not end at the doors of Le Jardin. They turned their attention to the broader issues that plagued society, their voices joining the chorus of those who demanded change and equality. They spoke out against the systemic racism that had been woven into the very fabric of the nation, their words echoing through the halls of government and the streets of cities across the country. They called for reform in the criminal justice system, for an end to the prejudice and bias that had been allowed to fester and grow unchecked for far too long. And as they stood there, their voices ringing out loud and clear, they knew that they were not alone. They were part of a movement, a force for change that would not be silenced or ignored. And with each passing day, that force grew stronger, its momentum unstoppable as it barreled towards a future that was brighter and more just than ever before. The story of Naomi's struggle and triumph had sparked a flame that burned brightly in the hearts of people across the nation. It was a reminder that the fight for justice was a shared responsibility, that it required the collective effort of every individual to stand up and demand change. And as the city of Chicago stood tall and proud, a beacon of hope and progress, it was clear that the fight for equality and justice was far from over. But with each step forward, with each victory won, the promise of a brighter future grew ever closer, a testament to the power of determination, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of truth and justice. As time passed, the impact of Naomi and Jason's fight for justice reverberated through the city and beyond. Their story had become a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring countless others to stand up and demand change. The restaurant, once a bastion of exclusivity and prejudice, had been transformed into a beacon of inclusivity and equality. Its new management was committed to creating a space where everyone felt welcome and valued, regardless of the color of their skin. The changes were not just cosmetic, they were systemic, woven into the very fabric of the establishment. Staff were trained in diversity and inclusion, their minds open to the importance of empathy and understanding. Policies were overhauled, ensuring that discrimination would never again be tolerated or ignored. And as the restaurant reopened its doors, it stood as a testament to the power of change and the unyielding pursuit of justice. But the true measure of their victory was not in the transformation of a single establishment, but in the ripple effect that spread throughout the community. People from all walks of life came together, their voices united in a call for equality and justice. Naomi and Jason stood at the heart of it all, their spirits unbroken and their resolve unwavering. They had fought for justice, not just for themselves, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. And as they looked out at the sea of faces before them, they knew that their fight had been worth it. They had sparked a flame that would burn brightly in the hearts of people for generations to come, a beacon of hope and resilience that would light the way towards a future that was truly equal and just. And so, with a sense of triumph and determination, they continued their fight, their voices ringing out loud and clear as they called for change and demanded justice for all.